Isn't it true that you want to fly commercial so that you can fly in luxury? How much money did you pay for Tyler Perry's Gulfstream jet, for example?
Well, for example, that's really none of your business.
Imagine telling the world you already know the exact day your life will end, because God personally revealed it to you. That is precisely what Kenneth Copeland has done. Yet, as his 90th year approaches, old scandals, failed prophecies, and questions surrounding his ministry are drawing fresh attention. Behind decades of sermons and unwavering confidence lies a story filled with controversy, power, and claims that continue to divide millions. The day Kenneth Copeland says he'll die. Few public figures have ever claimed to know the exact day their life will end. Yet that is precisely what Kenneth Copeland told his followers during a service at Eagle Mountain International Church in Newark, Texas, in late 2024. What began as another sermon quickly turned into one of the most extraordinary declarations of his decades-long ministry. Speaking to his congregation, Copeland said God had revealed a series of prophetic messages about the years ahead. According to him, 2025 would be the year the nation comes alive, while 2026 would be the big fix. Then he made the statement that immediately drew widespread attention. He claimed he had entered into a covenant with God and would die on December 6, 2056, his 120th birthday. Copeland did not describe it as a personal hope or something he believed might happen. He presented it as a certainty, telling his audience that the date had been revealed directly by God. That declaration sparked an obvious question. What would convince someone to believe they already knew the exact day their earthly life would end? For many of Copeland's supporters, the answer was simple. They trusted the man they had followed for decades. Others, however, saw the announcement as another example of a pattern that had followed his ministry for years. One of the most outspoken critics is Minister Justin Peters, who has closely examined the teachings of the Word of Faith movement. In January 2025, Peters highlighted several of Copeland's well-known prophecies that he argued had failed to come true. Among them was the prediction that Donald Trump would win the 2020 presidential election, along with forecasts of sweeping Republican victories that never materialized. Peters also pointed to Copeland's public declaration in April 2020 that COVID-19 had been destroyed forever, despite the tragic loss of more than 1 million American lives in the years that followed. To critics, those examples raised serious concerns about Copeland's prophetic claims, yet none of the controversy appeared to weaken his influence. His ministry continued to attract millions of followers who remained convinced that he spoke with divine authority. But perhaps the biggest question was never whether his prophecies would come true. It was how those claims helped fuel an organization that grew into one of the wealthiest and most influential religious ministries in America. To understand that, we have to look beyond the pulpit and inside the remarkable empire those beliefs helped create, where the donations really went. As Kenneth Copeland's ministry continued to grow, so did the scale of the world surrounding it. What began as a preaching ministry eventually transformed into an operation unlike almost any other in American religion. Supporters viewed it as evidence of God's abundant blessing. Critics saw something far more difficult to explain. At the heart of the organization sits a sprawling 1,500-acre headquarters in Newark, Texas, built on what was once a United States Marine Corps air station. Rather than replacing the former military runway, the ministry incorporated it into the property, creating what is now known as Kenneth Copeland Airport, complete with private hangars, fueling stations, maintenance facilities, television studios, warehouses, offices, and international ministry operations. The campus functions less like a traditional church and more like a self-contained corporate headquarters. Yet no part of the ministry has attracted more public attention than its aircraft. Among the fleet is a Gulfstream 5 valued at approximately $36 million, alongside a Cessna Citation X worth around $20 million and a Cessna Citation Bravo estimated between $2 and $5 million. Reports state that the Gulfstream was acquired from filmmaker Tyler Perry, although the final purchase price has never been publicly disclosed. What happened afterward only fueled the debate. After obtaining the Gulfstream, Copeland appealed to his supporters to contribute an additional $17 to $20 million to expand and improve the airport's runway and hangar. To critics, it raised an uncomfortable question: if the ministry could afford one of the world's most luxurious private aircraft, why were donors being asked to finance the facilities needed to house it? The questions did not stop with the jets. Copeland's personal residence is an approximately 18,000 square foot lakefront mansion situated on 24 acres near Fort Worth. The home includes 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, sweeping staircases, crystal chandeliers, and imported castle doors from Europe. Estimated to be worth around $7 million, the property is classified as a parsonage, making it exempt from property taxes. Reports indicate that exemption represents more than $150,000 in lost tax revenue each year. Other reports have described a collection of roughly 36 Breitling luxury watches, including several diamond-studded pieces, along with a Bentley featuring a custom Breitling clock built into its dashboard. In 2009, Copeland also sought to have a private jet valued at $3.6 million recognized as tax-exempt, but the Internal Revenue Service denied the request. Taken individually, each of these details sparked headlines. Together, they painted a picture that continued to divide public opinion. To devoted followers, these possessions reflected the rewards of unwavering faith. To skeptics, they prompted deeper questions about how tax-exempt donations were being spent and whether enough financial transparency truly existed. Eventually, those questions grew beyond newspaper headlines and television reports. They reached Washington, where one United States senator decided it was time to look behind the ministry's finances. What followed became one of the most significant investigations Kenneth Copeland had ever faced. And the people who once worked inside the organization would soon begin telling their own stories. What former insiders revealed. By the time questions surrounding Kenneth Copeland's ministry reached Washington, the spotlight had grown impossible to ignore. On November 5, 2007, United States Senator Chuck Grassley launched an inquiry into 6 prominent televangelist ministries, seeking to determine whether tax-exempt organizations were being used to support extravagant personal lifestyles rather than their stated religious missions. Kenneth Copeland Ministries was one of those placed under scrutiny. Each ministry was asked to provide financial records before a December deadline. While some organizations, including those led by Joyce Meyer and Benny Hinn, cooperated with the request, Copeland's ministry took a very different approach. According to Grassley's office, the response failed to provide the information investigators were seeking. Instead, the ministry argued that the Senate had no authority to examine its internal finances, leaving many of the questions unanswered. As lawmakers searched for documentation, former employees began offering a glimpse into how the ministry operated behind closed doors. One former staff member told CBS News that hundreds of prayer requests arrived every day, many accompanied by donations from people hoping Kenneth Copeland would personally pray for them. Instead, the employee described an automated process. Staff members selected pre-programmed responses on a computer, generating personalized letters without Copeland ever reading the requests himself. For countless supporters, the experience they believed was deeply personal was, according to those accounts, handled almost entirely by a computerized system. Additional allegations soon followed. Michael Hoover, who worked for the ministry for 5 years before leaving in 2005, claimed employees were assigned tasks connected to private businesses owned by members of the Copeland family. Senate investigators later identified links between the ministry and family-related ventures involving aviation, cattle, horses, real estate, and oil and gas interests. Flight records obtained by WFAA also showed ministry aircraft traveling to destinations that included Hawaii, a South Texas game ranch, a Colorado ski resort, and shopping trips to Naples, Florida. Perhaps the most troubling claims came from former staff members who described an atmosphere of fear. According to testimony included in the Senate investigation, employees were warned that speaking against the ministry could bring devastating consequences. Some claimed they were told God would punish their finances, their families, and their lives if they questioned or criticized Kenneth Copeland, who was portrayed as God's anointed servant. Despite the growing number of allegations, the investigation ended in January 2011 without penalties. Grassley's staff later acknowledged they never issued subpoenas, explaining that many potential witnesses feared retaliation. The financial investigation may have closed, but the controversy surrounding Kenneth Copeland was far from over. In the years that followed, attention shifted away from money and towards something even more personal, the health and well-being of the people who trusted his ministry. That next chapter would begin with a preventable outbreak inside his own church. The cost of blind faith. Long before Kenneth Copeland's response to COVID-19 became a global talking point, another health crisis had already exposed the consequences of the beliefs promoted within his ministry. This time, the controversy wasn't about money or politics. It was about whether faith alone could replace modern medicine. In August 2013, a traveler returning from overseas unknowingly brought the measles virus into Eagle Mountain International Church. Within days, the infection spread through the congregation, eventually sickening 21 people. Among those infected was a 4-month-old baby, far too young to receive the recommended measles vaccine. Health officials later confirmed that 16 of the 21 cases involved individuals who had never been vaccinated. Every school-aged child who contracted the disease was being homeschooled, making the outbreak one of the largest measles clusters reported in the United States that year. The numbers alone were alarming, but many believed the real story lay in the church's culture. Former member Amy Arden told the Associated Press that vaccinations were often viewed as a sign of fear rather than faith. According to her, choosing to be immunized suggested a lack of trust in God's protection, an attitude that discouraged many families from seeking routine medical care. Public comments made by the Copelands before the outbreak only intensified the scrutiny. During a 2010 webcast, Kenneth Copeland criticized the vaccination process, describing it as downright criminal. Gloria Copeland later encouraged viewers to rely on their faith instead of receiving flu shots, saying that Jesus himself had already provided believers with the protection they needed. Critics argued that messages like these helped create an environment where medical advice was often viewed with suspicion. When an infectious disease entered the congregation, they believed the consequences became impossible to ignore. Following the outbreak, the ministry quickly organized free vaccination clinics, where approximately 220 people received immunizations. Ministry representatives insisted they had never adopted an anti-vaccine position. Yet, comments made during the crisis continued to draw attention. Terry Copeland Pearsons told the congregation that while facts mattered, the truth always overcomes facts, a statement that many observers saw as reflecting the ministry's broader approach to faith and evidence. The outbreak eventually subsided, but the debate surrounding the ministry's teachings did not. What happened in 2013 would soon be overshadowed by a crisis on a much larger scale. 7 years later, as a pandemic brought the entire world to a standstill, Kenneth Copeland delivered a televised message that would become one of the most controversial moments of his entire career. The sermon the world couldn't believe. By 2020, the world was facing a crisis unlike anything seen in generations. As COVID-19 spread across continents, businesses shut down, hospitals filled with patients, and millions of families faced uncertainty about what the future might hold. While governments and medical experts urged caution, Kenneth Copeland offered a very different response. Speaking to his followers, Copeland insisted that he would never contract the virus because he walked by faith. He compared COVID-19 to the flu and suggested that healing was available to those who believed. But it was one televised service only weeks later that would place him at the center of worldwide attention. Standing inside an almost empty church in April 2020, Copeland looked directly into the camera and declared that COVID-19 had been destroyed forever. He then dramatically blew toward the camera, calling on the wind of God to drive the virus away and commanding divine power to eliminate the disease. The moment spread across the internet at remarkable speed. Within days, the clip amassed millions of views and spread across social media, comedy shows, and remixes. It quickly became one of the pandemic's most talked-about viral moments. Supporters praised it as a powerful display of faith, while critics called it deeply controversial. A brief smile during the sermon further intensified public debate over its meaning. Yet another announcement made during that same service received far less public attention. As millions of people were losing jobs, struggling to pay rent, and facing severe financial hardship, Copeland told his audience that God had instructed the ministry to receive $300 million in income during 2020. He made it clear that the pandemic would not change that goal. For critics, the timing raised difficult ethical questions, especially as many supporters were experiencing one of the worst economic downturns in recent history. Previous broadcasts also came under renewed scrutiny. Copeland had encouraged viewers to place their hands on television screens while he prayed, suggesting they could receive healing through faith. Critics worried that messages like these might discourage some people from seeking professional medical care during a pandemic that ultimately claimed more than 1 million lives in the United States. Although the Wind of God sermon made Kenneth Copeland one of the most talked-about religious figures in America, it did little to slow the growth of his ministry. Behind the headlines, viral videos, and public criticism remained a carefully structured organization that had spent decades expanding its influence. What many people didn't realize was that this was never the story of one man alone. It was the story of a ministry transformed into a family dynasty, built over decades, and connected to some of the most powerful circles in American politics. How Kenneth Copeland built an untouchable empire. Kenneth Copeland's influence did not grow overnight. Long before he became one of America's most recognizable televangelists, his ambitions were leading him down a very different path. Born on December 6, 1936, in Lubbock, Texas, Copeland spent much of his childhood fascinated by airplanes while growing up near a military airfield after his parents divorced. His early dreams had little to do with preaching. Instead, he pursued a career in music, learning to play the saxophone and performing during the height of rock and roll's popularity in the 1950s. His biggest break came in 1957 when he recorded Pledge of Love with Imperial Records. The song climbed into Billboard's top 40, reached number 17, remained on the charts for 15 weeks, and even earned him an appearance on American Bandstand. At the time, it appeared that music, not ministry, would define his future. But success proved short-lived. His first marriage to Ivy Bodiford in 1955 resulted in the birth of their daughter, Terry, before ending in divorce just a few years later. He married Cynthia Davis in 1958, but that relationship also ended. By his mid-20s, Copeland had already experienced 2 failed marriages, a striking contrast to the covenant-centered teachings he would later spend decades preaching. Everything changed after his marriage to Gloria Neese in 1962. As his spiritual convictions deepened, he enrolled at Oral Roberts University in 1967, where he eventually became Oral Roberts's personal pilot and chauffeur. Flying Roberts to revival meetings across the country gave Copeland a front-row seat to one of the most influential ministries of the era. During that time, he also studied under Kenneth E. Hagin, whose word of faith teachings emphasized the power of positive confession and speaking blessings into existence. Later that same year, on September 7, 1967, Kenneth and Gloria founded Kenneth Copeland Ministries. Combining Roberts's fundraising model with Hagin's theological influence, the ministry steadily expanded from a modest outreach into an international organization with television broadcasts, publishing operations, a Bible college, and a global network of supporters. As the ministry expanded, so did the family's influence. More than 20 relatives reportedly held leadership roles, with children, in-laws, and grandchildren overseeing key departments. Over time, executive leadership, ministry operations, and public outreach became increasingly concentrated within the Copeland family. Copeland's influence reached into politics as well. He joined Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, prayed with him before the 2016 election, and remained a visible supporter afterward. Admirers viewed this as proof of national influence, while critics saw an increasingly close relationship between religious leadership and political power. Former prosperity gospel insider Costi Hinn later emerged as one of the movement's most vocal critics, arguing that prosperity theology often enriched its leaders while exploiting the hopes of struggling believers. Public scrutiny intensified again in 2019 when Inside Edition reporter Lisa Guerrero questioned Copeland about his private jets. The interview quickly turned tense, with footage of the confrontation spreading across the internet and introducing millions of viewers to yet another controversy surrounding the televangelist. Decades after recording a hit song, Kenneth Copeland had built something far larger than a music career ever could have offered. What began as a small ministry evolved into a 1,500-acre headquarters, a private airport, international operations, political influence, and a family-led organization supported by millions of devoted followers. Today, Copeland continues to insist that God has already revealed the exact day his life will end. Whether history remembers him as a faithful preacher who inspired generations, or as one of the most controversial figures modern American religion has ever produced, may ultimately depend on one question that still divides people today. Was his extraordinary empire built on unwavering faith, or on the unwavering faith of those who believed every word he spoke? What do you think Kenneth Copeland's legacy will be? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to watch our next video for another story that challenges what you thought you knew.